How a Pilot Forgot the Sky He Fought For. Subtitle: The Man Who Flew Higher Than Fear and Never Came Back Down. There is a photograph in the National Archives, classified until 1998, showing a man standing beside an aircraft in the autumn of 1943. His uniform is pressed, his posture correct, his face calm. But if you look closely at his eyes, you will see something that should not be there. A distance that has nothing to do with the camera, a vacancy that suggests he is looking at something far beyond the horizon, something that exists only in his mind. His name was Captain James Holloway, and by the time this photograph was taken, he had already forgotten why he was fighting. Not because of trauma, not because of exhaustion, but because someone had carefully, methodically taught him to forget. This is not a story about courage in combat. It is not about heroism or sacrifice. It is a story about what happens when the machinery of war decides that a pilot's conscience is less important than his obedience, when loyalty becomes a reflex and doubt becomes a disease to be cured. It is about an experiment that was never officially documented, conducted by men who understood that the greatest battlefield is not in the sky, but in the space between thought and action, where belief is formed and identity dissolves. In the winter of 1942, the Allied air campaign over Europe was failing in ways that statistics could not capture. Bombers returned with their payloads intact, pilots reported equipment malfunctions that engineers could never find, and during debriefings, men who had been fearless weeks earlier now spoke in careful, measured tones about visibility and wind patterns and the impossibility of hitting targets they had been ordered to destroy. The military psychologists called it operational fatigue, but the intelligence officers knew better. They knew it was something deeper, something that happened when men flew too high and saw too much, when the abstraction of war became concrete and the orders from above began to feel like murder from below. The problem was not fear. Fear could be managed, could be overcome, could be turned into fuel for aggression. The problem was moral hesitation, the small voice that asked questions in the moment when a bomb was released, the brief flash of imagination that allowed a pilot to see the people below not as targets but as lives. It was a weakness, the strategists agreed, but it was also a uniquely human weakness, one that could not be trained away through conventional methods. And so a different approach was required, one that would not eliminate fear but would eliminate the capacity to question, one that would turn pilots into instruments as reliable and unthinking as the machines they flew. The program was called Operation Clarity, though that name appears in no official record. It was conceived by a joint task force of military psychologists, intelligence officers, and a small group of scientists whose previous work had been in advertising and mass persuasion. Their insight was simple and terrifying. If you could control what a man remembered, you could control what he believed, and if you could control what he believed, you could control what he was willing to do. The human mind, they understood, was not a fortress to be stormed but a house to be remodeled, room by room, until the original architecture was unrecognizable. Captain James Holloway was selected not because he was weak, but because he was strong. At 26, he had flown 47 missions over occupied Europe, had earned commendations for accuracy and composure under fire, and had the kind of steady nerves that made him a natural leader. But in his most recent debriefings, something had changed. His reports had become more detailed, his descriptions of the targets more specific, and his questions about mission objectives more frequent. He had begun to remember too clearly what he was bombing, and memory, the psychologists knew, was the enemy of efficiency. The process began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Holloway was reassigned to a training facility in the countryside, told that he would be helping to develop new tactical approaches for precision bombing. The facility was isolated, surrounded by fields and forests, far from the noise and chaos of active air bases. There were no other pilots there, only instructors and technicians and doctors who asked questions about his sleep patterns and his dreams. The days followed a strict routine. Morning briefings, afternoon flight simulations, evening debriefings that lasted longer than they should have, sessions where he was asked to describe his missions in exhaustive detail, to recall not just what he had done but what he had felt, what he had thought, what he had seen in his mind's eye as the bombs fell away. At first it seemed like therapy. The doctors were patient and understanding, never pushing, never judging, always listening with the kind of attention that made you want to talk more, to explain more, to justify the things you had done. Holloway found himself speaking about missions he had not thought about in months, describing the way the smoke rose from the factories, the way the light caught the river below, the way his hands had felt on the controls in the moment before he released the payload. And after each session, he felt lighter, as if the weight of those memories had been lifted, as if the act of speaking them aloud had somehow diminished their power. But the debriefings were only the beginning. After each session, Holloway was given what the doctors called recuperative conditioning, a process that involved sitting in a darkened room while a film played on the wall in front of him. The films were strange and hypnotic, sequences of images that seemed to have no narrative structure, just patterns of light and shadow, shapes that repeated and transformed, scenes of clouds and sky and aircraft in flight, all set to a low droning sound that filled the room and made it impossible to think clearly. He was told that the films were designed to help him relax, to process the stress of combat, to prepare his mind for the next phase of training. And he believed them because there was no reason not to, because the doctors were kind and the facility was safe and the war was far away. What Holloway did not know was that the films were carefully constructed psychological instruments, designed not to relax but to rewrite. Each sequence was built around a specific emotional response, a carefully calibrated pattern of imagery and sound that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the deeper structures of memory and belief. The clouds were not just clouds, they were symbols of distance and abstraction, visual metaphors for altitude and detachment. The aircraft were not just machines, they were extensions of will, instruments of order imposed on chaos. And woven throughout, almost too subtle to perceive, were images of targets transformed into geometric shapes, factories reduced to blueprints, cities rendered as maps, all of it designed to train his mind to see the world from above as a problem to be solved rather than a place where people lived. The process was gradual and cumulative. Each session built on the last, layering new associations over old memories, gently eroding the emotional context that gave those memories their moral weight. The doctors monitored his progress through a series of tests disguised as routine evaluations, measuring his response times, his word choices, his unconscious reactions to specific images and phrases. They were looking for a particular kind of change, a flattening of effect, a simplification of thought, a narrowing of focus that would make him more effective in the air and less troubled by what he had done. And it worked. Slowly, incrementally, Holloway began to change. He noticed it first in his dreams, which became less vivid and more abstract, less about people and more about procedures, less about consequences and more about completion. He noticed it in his conversations with the instructors, where he found himself using their language, their frameworks, their way of describing missions as operations and targets as objectives. He noticed it in the way he thought about his previous flights, how the memories that had once been sharp and painful now felt distant and clinical, like something he had read about rather than experienced. By the spring of 1943, Holloway had become exactly what Operation Clarity was designed to create: a pilot without doubt. His skills had not diminished. If anything, they had improved, sharpened by the removal of hesitation, refined by the elimination of moral friction. He could calculate bomb trajectories with perfect precision, could maintain formation in the worst weather, could follow orders with the kind of mechanical reliability that made him invaluable to his commanders. But something essential had been lost, some quality of humanity that had once made him more than just an operator of machinery. When he returned to active duty in the summer of 1943, his superiors were impressed by his performance. He flew missions with a cold efficiency that bordered on the inhuman, never questioning his orders, never expressing doubt, never allowing himself to imagine what happened when his bombs found their targets. His crewmates noticed the change but could not articulate what was different. He was still competent, still reliable, still the same man in all the ways that mattered for combat. But in the moments between missions, when other pilots would talk about home or make jokes to ease the tension, Holloway would sit quietly, staring at nothing as if waiting for instructions that never came. The photograph in the archives was taken during one of these moments. It was meant to be propaganda, an image of Allied strength and determination, a portrait of a hero for the newspapers back home. But the photographer, a young corporal who had taken hundreds of such portraits, would later say that Holloway's face had disturbed him in a way he could not explain. There was nothing wrong with the composition, nothing technically flawed about the image. But when he developed the film and saw Holloway's eyes, he felt as if he were looking at someone who had been emptied out, someone who had traded his soul for the ability to function without conscience. The experiment that created James Holloway was not unique. Across multiple air bases in England and North Africa, Operation Clarity was being refined and expanded, tested on pilots who showed signs of what the psychologists called moral fatigue. The methods varied slightly from facility to facility, but the principle remained the same: control memory, control belief, control action. Some pilots responded better than others. Some resisted in ways that the doctors could not anticipate or overcome. But enough succeeded, enough were transformed, that the program was deemed effective and quietly integrated into standard training protocols under different names and bureaucratic designations. The true horror of Operation Clarity was not in its methods but in its logic. The architects of the program did not see themselves as monsters or torturers. They saw themselves as pragmatists, as men making difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. They believed, genuinely, that they were helping, that by removing the psychological barriers that caused pilots to suffer, they were creating better soldiers and better men. They never asked whether a man without conscience was still a man, whether a pilot without memory was still a person, whether the ability to kill without feeling was a strength or a kind of death. Holloway flew until the end of the war, completing 112 missions, more than almost any other pilot in his squadron. He survived battles that killed men around him, returned from flights that should have been fatal, and earned medals that were pinned to his uniform in ceremonies where he stood silent and unsmiling, as if the recognition belonged to someone else. When the war ended and he returned home, he found that he could not remember why he had fought, could not recall the beliefs that had once motivated him, could not connect the man he had been before the war with the man he had become. He tried to reintegrate into civilian life, took a job as a commercial pilot, married a woman he had known before the war. But the distance that had been visible in his eyes in that 1943 photograph never left. His wife would later say that living with him was like living with a ghost, someone who went through the motions of existence but never seemed fully present, never seemed to feel anything deeply or care about anything profoundly. He would sit for hours staring at the sky, not with longing or nostalgia, but with the blank focus of someone waiting for orders that would never come. In 1952, Holloway flew his plane into a mountainside during a routine cargo flight. The weather was clear, the aircraft in perfect condition, the flight path well within his capabilities. The investigators could find no mechanical failure, no evidence of distress, no reason why an experienced pilot would make such a basic error. The official report listed it as pilot error, possibly due to momentary disorientation. But those who had known him, who had seen the emptiness in his eyes, understood that it was not an accident. It was not suicide either, not in any conscious sense. It was simply the final conclusion of a process that had begun a decade earlier, the moment when a man who had forgotten how to be human finally stopped pretending. The files on Operation Clarity remained classified for decades, buried in archives that few knew existed and fewer could access. When they were finally declassified in the late 1990s, they arrived with so many redactions that the full scope of the program could never be reconstructed. Names had been blacked out, methodologies obscured, outcomes summarized in language so technical and bureaucratic that the human cost was invisible. The few researchers who examined the documents noted the efficiency of the program, the sophistication of its psychological techniques, the way it had anticipated modern neuroscience by decades. But they rarely asked the question that mattered most. What had been the point of victory if it required turning men into machines? The story of James Holloway is not unique, though his name may be. Across the history of modern warfare, similar experiments have been conducted, similar methods refined, similar transformations achieved. The technologies have advanced, the understanding of human psychology has deepened, but the fundamental logic remains unchanged. The mind is a battlefield, memory is a weapon, and control is achieved not through force but through the careful manipulation of what people believe to be true. Every war produces its Holloways, men and women who are transformed by processes they do not understand, who sacrifice not just their bodies but their capacity for moral thought, who return home carrying victories they cannot remember and performing duties they no longer question. The architects of these programs are never held accountable, because their work is always classified, always justified by necessity, always defended as a lesser evil in service of a greater good. They write papers on operational psychology and combat effectiveness, publish studies on stress management and performance optimization, speak at conferences about resilience and adaptation. They never use words like erasure or reprogramming or the destruction of conscience. They never acknowledge that what they are doing is not healing but harm, not treatment but transformation, not therapy but a kind of murder that leaves the body intact while killing everything that makes it human. And the rest of us, who were not there, who did not fly those missions or undergo that conditioning, we look at the photographs and read the histories and tell ourselves that it was different then, that the pressures were unique, that such things could not happen now. We comfort ourselves with the belief that we would resist, that we would see through the manipulation, that our memories and beliefs are too strong to be rewritten. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. We are all vulnerable to the same techniques, subject to the same psychological laws, capable of the same transformations. The only difference is opportunity and intent, the presence of someone who understands how malleable the mind truly is and is willing to exploit that knowledge. The sky James Holloway forgot was not just the physical sky he flew through, though that was part of it. It was the sky of meaning, the vast space of moral understanding that allows us to see our actions as part of a larger human story, to connect cause and effect, choice and consequence, order and suffering. It was the sky that gives context to courage and makes sacrifice meaningful, the sky that holds memory and belief and the capacity to judge our own actions. When that sky disappeared, when those connections were severed and those memories dimmed, what remained was not a hero but a function, not a person but a process, not a man but a machine that looked like one. There are those who would argue that this was necessary, that war requires such sacrifices, that the alternative would have been worse. They would point to the missions completed, the objectives achieved, the strategic victories won through the efforts of men like Holloway. They would say that questioning these methods is a luxury afforded by peace, that those who have never faced such choices cannot understand the calculations that must be made. And perhaps they are right in a certain narrow sense. Perhaps Operation Clarity and programs like it did contribute to victory, did save lives in some abstract accounting. But they ignore the deeper question: what kind of victory is worth the cost of human consciousness itself? What kind of peace can be built on the ruins of men who have been systematically stripped of their capacity to care? The answer, if we are honest, is that we do not know because we have never seriously asked. We have never demanded a full accounting of the psychological operations conducted in the name of national security, never insisted on transparency about the methods used to shape the minds of soldiers, never questioned whether the power to reprogram human belief should exist at all, regardless of how it might be used. We have accepted, tacitly and without much reflection, that the mind is simply another weapon to be refined and deployed, that consciousness is just another battlefield to be conquered, that the interior life of a person is less important than their operational effectiveness. This acceptance is itself a kind of forgetting, a collective amnesia about what it means to be human and what lines should never be crossed even in the darkest moments of history. It is the same forgetting that allowed Operation Clarity to exist in the first place, the same logic that justified its methods and celebrated its results. It is the forgetting that happens when we stop seeing soldiers as people and start seeing them as assets, when we stop measuring victory in terms of justice and start measuring it in terms of objectives achieved, when we stop asking whether something should be done and only ask whether it can be done. James Holloway died in 1952, but the systems that created him have only grown more sophisticated. The language has changed, the technologies have advanced, the understanding of neuroplasticity and behavioral conditioning has deepened. But the fundamental project remains the same: the engineering of consent, the manufacture of belief, the careful construction of minds that will obey without questioning and perform without hesitating. These techniques are no longer limited to military applications. They have spread into advertising, politics, education, every domain where someone wishes to influence how others think and what they are willing to accept as true. We live in a world built on the logic of Operation Clarity, where attention is weaponized and memory is manipulated, where the difference between persuasion and programming has become so thin as to be nearly invisible. We scroll through carefully curated feeds designed to reinforce our existing beliefs and eliminate cognitive dissonance. We absorb narratives that simplify complexity and erase context, that reduce moral questions to tactical choices and transform human suffering into acceptable collateral damage. We train ourselves, with no external coercion required, to think in the patterns and categories that make us most useful to the systems we serve. And like Holloway, most of us do not notice the transformation as it happens. We do not feel the moment when questioning becomes uncomfortable, when doubt becomes unbearable, when the ability to imagine alternative perspectives begins to fade. We simply wake up one day and realize that we can no longer remember why we believed certain things, why certain values once seemed important, why we once thought it mattered to understand the full consequences of our choices. We have forgotten the sky we lived under, the expansive space of possibility and moral agency, and we have learned to navigate by the narrow instruments provided to us, trusting that someone else has determined the correct heading. The photograph of Captain James Holloway remains in the National Archives, available to anyone who knows where to look. It is not a famous image, it appears in no documentaries, illustrates no history books, generates no pilgrimages from those interested in the war. It is simply one photograph among millions, a routine portrait of a routine soldier, remarkable only for what it reveals if you know how to see it. The emptiness in his eyes is not unique to him. It is a template, a preview, a warning about what happens when the machinery of control is turned against the human capacity for moral thought. If you look at that photograph long enough, if you really study his face and try to imagine the man he was before Operation Clarity and the man he became after, you might begin to understand the true nature of psychological warfare. It is not about breaking the enemy's will or destroying their capacity to fight. It is about something far more subtle and far more complete. The erasure of the self, the replacement of human consciousness with programmed response, the transformation of a person into an instrument. It is about creating individuals who can perform any action without experiencing it as a moral choice, who can follow any order without connecting it to consequences, who can live entire lives without ever asking whether what they are doing is right. This is the invisible war, the one fought not with bullets and bombs but with images and narratives and carefully constructed experiences that shape what we remember and therefore what we believe. It is the war that never ends because it is never acknowledged, the war that claims no official casualties because its victims remain alive and functional, walking through the world with the same faces and names but hollowed out from within, their capacity for moral reasoning replaced with something that looks like conviction but is actually just conditioning. The men who designed Operation Clarity are long dead, their names lost to classification and time. But their work continues, refined and perfected, applied in contexts they never imagined by people who have learned the same fundamental lesson: that human consciousness is not a sacred mystery but a biological process that can be understood, predicted, and manipulated. That belief is neither a choice nor a conviction but a pattern of neural activation that can be shaped through the right combination of stimuli and repetition. That a person who has been properly conditioned will defend their programming as vigorously as they would defend their freedom, because they can no longer tell the difference between what they chose to believe and what they were taught to believe. James Holloway never recovered his capacity for doubt. He never questioned why he could not remember the reasons he had fought, never wondered about the weeks he spent in that training facility, never suspected that the man he had become was not the result of combat stress but of systematic psychological reconstruction. He lived the rest of his life as a ghost of his former self, going through motions without meaning, performing functions without understanding, existing in a state of perpetual waiting for orders that would give him purpose. And when he died, when his plane struck that mountainside under clear skies, the official record noted pilot error and moved on, because the truth was too disturbing to acknowledge and too dangerous to investigate. But the truth persists, buried in declassified files and forgotten photographs, visible to anyone willing to look closely enough and think carefully about what they see. The truth is that we have learned, over decades of war and peace, how to dismantle human consciousness and rebuild it according to specifications. We have learned how to take someone who asks questions and turn them into someone who only follows answers. We have learned how to make people forget not just specific memories but the capacity for certain kinds of thought, to erase not just what they know but how they know it. And having learned these things, having perfected these techniques, having demonstrated their effectiveness again and again, we have never stopped using them. We have simply learned to be more subtle, more distributed, more systemic in their application. We no longer need facilities in the countryside where pilots are sent for special conditioning. The conditioning happens everywhere, all the time, through every screen and speaker and social system that surrounds us. We are all, in our own ways, undergoing the same process that transformed James Holloway, the same gradual erosion of context and meaning, the same slow replacement of human judgment with programmed response. The difference is that we do not recognize it as such. We experience it as normal life, as adaptation to modern reality, as the necessary evolution of consciousness in a complex world. We do not feel the loss of what we never knew we had, cannot mourn the erasure of capacities we never consciously developed. We simply become, year by year, more like Holloway in that photograph. Present but absent, functional but empty, alive in every measurable way except the ones that matter most. This is the final lesson of Operation Clarity, the truth that its architects understood but never stated explicitly, that control is most complete when it is invisible, when the controlled believe themselves to be free, when the transformation feels like choice and the programming feels like conviction. James Holloway never knew what had been done to him, and that ignorance was not a flaw in the system but its perfection. He could not resist what he could not perceive, could not mourn what he did not remember losing, could not question the beliefs that had been placed in his mind because they felt indistinguishable from his own thoughts. We are his descendants, inheritors of a world where such techniques are no longer experimental but operational, no longer classified but normalized, no longer something done to soldiers in wartime but something done to everyone all the time. We have forgotten what it was like to think without guardrails, to remember without curation, to believe without having been taught what to believe. We have forgotten the sky itself, the vast openness of human consciousness before it was mapped and claimed and divided into territories of acceptable thought. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of psychological warfare. Not that it changes what people think, but that it makes them forget they ever thought differently, that it erases the very possibility of questioning by making questions feel unnecessary or dangerous or simply beyond consideration. James Holloway forgot the sky he fought for because that sky was systematically removed from his memory and replaced with something simpler and more controllable. We are forgetting the same sky, slowly and collectively, through processes so gradual and distributed that they feel like nothing at all. The photograph remains. The files remain. The evidence remains for those who seek it. But evidence without understanding is just data, and understanding without will is just knowledge. What is required is not just awareness of what was done to James Holloway, but recognition of what is being done to all of us, the same techniques applied more broadly and subtly, the same logic of control extended into every corner of human experience. What is required is the courage to look directly at that emptiness in his eyes and see it as a mirror, to acknowledge that the distance between who he was and who he became is the same distance we travel every day without noticing. The war James Holloway fought ended in 1945, but the war for human consciousness has never ended. It has only become more sophisticated, more pervasive, more successful. Every generation produces new Holloways, people who wake up one day and realize they cannot remember why they believed certain things or how they came to accept certain truths. Every system of power discovers anew the techniques for making people into instruments, for replacing thought with reflex and judgment with programming. And every time we tell ourselves it is different, that we would resist, that our minds are too strong to be manipulated. But James Holloway was strong. He was brave and capable and intelligent. He was not weak or broken or vulnerable in any obvious way. He was simply human, subject to the same psychological laws as everyone else, possessing the same malleable consciousness that can be shaped and reshaped by those who understand its mechanisms. His transformation was not a failure of character but a demonstration of technique, not evidence of individual weakness but proof of systemic power. The sky he forgot was the sky of meaning and memory, the sky of moral awareness and human connection, the sky that makes us more than machines that respond to stimuli. When that sky disappeared, when those connections were severed and that awareness dimmed, what remained was efficient but no longer human in any meaningful sense. He flew higher than fear, as the subtitle promises, but he also flew higher than conscience, higher than memory, higher than the capacity to understand what he had lost. He never came back down, not because he remained in the air, but because the person who had climbed into that aircraft had been replaced by something else, something that could perform all the same functions but lacked the inner life that makes those functions meaningful. He never came back down because there was nowhere to return to, no self left intact enough to reclaim, no memory strong enough to ground him in a reality beyond orders and operations. This is what it means to fight the invisible war, to be a casualty of psychological operations. Not death but emptiness, not injury but erasure, not trauma but transformation into something that can no longer be traumatized because it can no longer truly feel. James Holloway stands for all those who have been systematically stripped of their humanity in service of efficiency, all those who have forgotten what they knew and lost what they were, all those who have been taught to see the world from such height that the people below become patterns rather than lives. His story is not history. It is prophecy. It is warning. It is the mirror we refuse to look into because we know what we will see. Ourselves, emptied out and programmed, functional and obedient, alive but no longer truly living. We are all pilots now, flying according to instruments we did not calibrate, following heading we did not choose, bombing targets we cannot quite see clearly enough to recognize as human. We are all forgetting the sky, losing the context that gives our actions meaning, accepting the conditioning that makes questioning feel like failure rather than wisdom. The photograph in the archives shows us where that path leads. The emptiness in James Holloway's eyes is our future if we do not learn to recognize the techniques being used against us, if we do not resist the gradual erosion of our capacity for moral thought, if we do not insist on remembering what it was like before we forgot how to remember. His face is a warning written in flesh and bone, a reminder that the greatest victories of warfare are not won on battlefields but in minds, not achieved through destruction but through transformation, not measured in territory conquered but in consciousness controlled. If you have listened this far, if you have followed James Holloway's story from that autumn day in 1943 to that clear morning in 1952 when he finally stopped pretending to be alive, then you already understand more than you wanted to. You understand that the war for the human mind is real and ongoing, that psychological operations are not conspiracy theories but documented fact, that the capacity to erase and replace human consciousness exists and has been used and continues to be refined. You understand that we are all vulnerable, all subjects of experiments we cannot perceive, all slowly being taught to forget the questions we should be asking. Subscribe to WarArchivesBlack and remember what James Holloway forgot. Remember that there was once a sky, vast and open, where thoughts could fly without restriction and beliefs could be held without having been implanted. Remember that consciousness is not a given but an achievement, not a possession but a practice, not something you have but something you must continually defend against those who would prefer you simplified, compliant, and useful. Like this video if you recognize the emptiness. Share it if you still remember what was lost. And return for the next archive because there are more stories like this one, more forgotten men and women, more programs and operations and experiments conducted in the shadows where oversight cannot reach and conscience does not apply. The sky is still there above us all. But every day more people forget to look up, forget that it exists, forget that there was ever anything beyond the instruments and orders and carefully constructed realities they have been taught to inhabit. James Holloway forgot and died forgetting. We still have time to remember if we choose to, if we dare to, if we can still recognize the difference between what we believe and what we have been taught to believe. But time is running short and the techniques are improving and the sky grows dimmer with each passing year. Soon, perhaps, we will all be like Holloway standing beside our machines with empty eyes, waiting for orders that will give us purpose, having forgotten entirely that we were once capable of choosing our own. If you have listened this far, you already know too much. Subscribe to WarArchivesBlack and remember, silence is control.